Hello.
Hello. How's Australia?
Well, it's actually been quite a pleasant day today. Let's try and move that. Is that all right? The backdrop's okay.
Lovely. Yes.
Nice and gay. Got a bit of
Yeah.
gay in there. Um, nice and sunny.
Lovely.
How long have we got?
We've got 30 minutes.
Have we 30 minutes, okay. Let's crack on with it.
Now
we better
recording, Robert.
Just double check before we begin. It was 2003 you came to Australia, wasn't it?
It was 2003, yes. Well remembered.
Yeah. Oh, well, I should hope so. I've done the research.
You were there. You were there.
I was there. And so not only, and Ed Birthstall was on the business seminar with you. But as I recall, did he not arrive and just do it by video?
He didn't arrive because you remember there was another virus going around at that time.
Is that the SARS?
Oh, yeah. So he wouldn't travel because of SARS.
Oh, interesting. And now he's at Liberty, or been at Liberty for some time.
No, that was a while back. He's since gone back to the US.
He's back in the States, and I think he went
to Hudson's.
Yeah, and I think he's
consulting trading, and I think he's now left there as well.
He did his great biography, which was hugely successful, written, I think, ghosted by Lucy Green, who was one of our ex-editors.
Really? Okay.
And did really well with that. And I think it was also being turned into a Netflix film or mini-series, according to Lucy. So I'm still waiting to hear about that. So that could be quite interesting. But I think he's now consulting. He's now out and about doing consulting.
Yes. Right. There you go. Okay.
But here we are.
I've got to do a two-screen, do I?
Yes, in a minute. We'll come to that. Don't worry.
Okay.
Here we are, 20 years on, and we wanted to have a quick chat with you because obviously you've been such an integral part in the story.
Let me turn down the air. Let me just turn down the air. Put the aircon on. Okay, that's better. Okay, no sound.
Because back in 2003, as you've said, you were then the director of the Melbourne Fashion Festival, which you had also founded, and you invited us to Australia.
Correct. Yes. Well, that's what I'm going to say in my intro bit.
Oh, very good. Oh, good. Well, you can repeat that without a problem. That's fine. And then began the relationship that we've enjoyed with you ever since. But I mean, tell us a little bit for you about the last 20 years in terms of how you think Australian retail has continued to grow and develop and change.
Well, I think when you came that time, I still remember the problems you caused me, because of course you had visited my department store. And I think the famous line from Martin was, as we descended the escalator, mediocrity came up to greet us.
I did, yes. I should have said it came up to greet us like a bad smell, but it was being polite.
And I think at that point, I may have been pre-float. Myer floated, of course, later for $4 a share, and today it's 20 cents.
Oh my God. So I wasn't so far off the truth.
You weren't so far off. And I spoke to Steve Bennett just about 2 hours ago. So of course, Steve Bennett, who founded Country Road and now consults with Mecca. And Steve said to say hello. He of course was there at the business seminar, and he said, oh, all the stuff that those guys said, if only we'd listened. I mean, we'd know we would have done a lot of different things.
But it is, I guess, a lot of those issues are, common across the globe, because a lot of those big retailers didn't adjust to what was happening online. They didn't really respond, I think, to the flexibility that you were beginning to see in fashion. People were noticing it. And I think the third bit is, in the face of ubiquity, which is a big problem, they continue to present ubiquity. So that, you think about the opportunities they have. And this is why I think now, do you think with COVID and with what's been happening to retail, with this reset, that people will come out and have learned different, or will they try to go back and do things as they've been previously doing them?
not working in retail or being a retail expert like you, I mean, my sense of it is that, like I would imagine you would say, that what the pandemic has done is probably jet propelled what was going to happen anyway. My sense is that probably we'll see, a third less retail stores. Obviously, the shift online has been dramatically accelerated, and those companies that hadn't, hadn't set up their online businesses to be robust enough to deal with that growth are in having a lot of trouble. Those ones that have acted quickly or did have already a fairly good systems in place are benefiting enormously from it. I think probably in Australia or in Melbourne, we're in lockdown, and so there are no shops open. And of course, there is that whole factor, the factor that people are actually living without going to a shop for months on end, which is the first time that's ever happened in their life. And so it's just a new, something they've learnt. They've learnt something different, and indeed learnt that they don't have to. Doesn't have to be part of their lives. And those people that hadn't really ever purchased online or had purchased online on a very limited basis now understand that it's very easy and something that is quite natural. And indeed, what will happen, of course, which I'm sure you'd say, is there won't even be a distinction between bricks and mortar and online anymore. It will simply be retail.
Yeah, which is...
And Robert, from a wider perspective, how do you think the Australian character or psyche has changed over the last 20 years? Do you think that has fundamentally shifted along with an acceptance of technology, or do you think it remains, broadly speaking, much the same?
It's interesting. I have been looking at Melbourne as a city recently, and to sort of reflect on what has changed. And I think that certainly when we were doing research into Melbourne as a retail city, or as a city 10 years ago, it was a much more interesting place than it is now. And that was because I think economically, Australia probably wasn't as wealthy as it had been, or has been, was, 2 years ago, a year ago, whatever. And so it had become lazy. And I think that meant that there'd become that the vitality that we saw 10 years ago, and probably even 30 years ago within Australia, was much greater because it was harder. It was a little more difficult, and people had to work a bit harder. And there was a lot of really interesting things happening, probably at a grassroots in retail, but also there was an awful lot happening in hospitality. And hospitality, I think, probably provided a lot of the energy that went on in at the retail level in Australia. And Australia was quite influential in that way. I'd say that in the last 10 years, that Australia's become a bit lazier, more complacent, much more global. There are far too many stores. The ubiquity that you talked about, it's just, that's happened, and all that has happened. And I think probably a lot of people within lots of industries have just thought about, getting on with making money rather than getting on with making relationships, or thinking more carefully about what you have to think about when times are more difficult. And so during the pandemic, that's what is a real wake-up call to so many people. How have they, all those retailers that can't rely on tourists anymore, all those retailers that can't rely on foreign students anymore, which is really the whole CBD of Melbourne, they've really they're going to have to readjust themselves and to rethink about their local audience and their relationships with their customers.
To do it. Do you think with that it's potentially too late, that each time retail has been given an opportunity to, you know, as if you're in a different sector, and I think you actually said this was once, with all the opportunities being presented, it will be impossible to fail. You know, we have the internet, we've got, you know, same day delivery, we've got same hour delivery now in London, so I don't even need to have to think about getting anything back to my house, et cetera, new kinds of payments. And yet retail consistently fails to jump on the opportunity. It always lags and then discovers it when it's slightly too late. So I just think, do you think there is a possibility that a lot of people will not recover, and potentially that's the way it should be, that we actually, their time has gone and it's now time for new, more interesting, younger retailers to step in and take over the baton?
Yes. In simply, I think yes, I think probably that's true, and probably there are just different models. I mean, there's a company in Australia, Kogan, who I've always dismissed as a pretty ordinary online, you know, cheap product retailer, who I wouldn't have ever looked at, but I've looked at recently and thought that, well, essentially there's something there. They're moving from just doing cheap product to thinking about building loyalty with their customers. Wow. And indeed, Kogan will become the department store of the future. And they're starting to think about what I thought retailers would have done a lot earlier, and that's think about service delivery and not just product delivery. So he's thinking about insurance, he's thinking about superannuation, he's thinking about you know, those sort of service delivery stuff, that it was a perfect opportunity for retailers. They had the audience, they had the customers, they had the loyalty. They could have moved in so many different directions, but they only thought about product, and they only thought of you know, things that they could hold. And that's a problem. And maybe that's, and so the people who didn't think beyond the physical product are the ones that are having so much trouble.
Well, now, interestingly, of course, that's much more your area of expertise now, isn't it? Because you've moved into the cultural remit, yeah, in terms of where you look and where you work. And so moving forward more into the future, I'm interested to think beyond necessarily just the commercial, to understand how you think your market, your society, Australia in general, is beginning to shift culturally, and not just because of the coronavirus pandemic, but potentially in wider, in a wider frame, in terms of understanding how you think it's now changing its understanding of society as a reflection of where it sits geographically, but then also just thinking again this question of how you believe your society is continuing to evolve and change as a culture.
Yeah, you know, Australia is wonderful in many ways, but Australia, you know, was referred to sort of sarcastically as the lucky country, and it has had enormous luck for really, you know, for 200 years, and it's continued to be able to exploit its resources very successfully, and so much of Australia is based on speculation and greed, and it's been an easy market. That's a frustrating element of Australian culture. That said, there is a risk-taking quality and a quality about Australians which, because of the distance from the rest of the world, has always encouraged them to look elsewhere and to consider what goes on in the world and to be open to new ideas. So that's a really good part of the Australian sort of character. And also I think there's a can-do attitude, an attitude which really does want to get on with things and not worry about the status quo. So it's not as hierarchical as other countries, and so that is in its favour. From a cultural point of view, I mean, at the moment, the arts community is suffering enormously because they can't show their work. They can't, galleries aren't open, museums aren't open, theatres aren't open, and so the contact between an audience has gone.
Yes.
And that's extremely frustrating. My thoughts at the moment are, and some things that I'm thinking about for the city, and I'm interested in cities, is how at this point in history we can think about maybe reintroducing creative industries and culture back into the centre of cities, or into the CBD, what we would call the Central Business District, and how you can embed creative production into cities. Because what's happened is, because of the I suppose economic boom, it's pushed artists, designers, creative makers out of cities, and I think that's to the detriment of cities. And so perhaps now, because people are going to be moving out, not going to be as willing to go back into offices, because the value of property in the central city areas is going to fall down, and because so many commercial, retail and office spaces are going to have to be rethought, this may be a perfect opportunity to think about how cultural production and creatives can actually be inserted back and embedded into the central district business precinct, and how that can re-engage and reinvigorate cities, so that they just don't become, as we've seen, a city like New York. I mean, Manhattan is as dull as all get out, because all the creatives have been pushed out. Now, perhaps with the fall in property values, this may be a time when that can be readdressed, and maybe we retrofit our buildings, our architecture, but also thinking about it in a long-term sense, so that it's not just in the past, artists and designers and creatives have been used as sort of the gentrification of areas. We have to think long-term how they're important in the social, the cultural and the economic life of our cities.
Yeah, absolutely.
Perfect. I mean, interesting you should say that, Robert, because I've just been putting a proposal together with a big essentially Stanhope PLC, who provide office accommodation in key centres like CBDs and that, so 300,000 square feet. And their big issue is, with the potential changes in how we structure offices and the way we look at work, will people want to come back to the office full time? So there will be a shift in how we engage with the office. B, what is it that makes us, if we no longer have to come to occupy a desk, what will make us come to those parts of the city? And one of the things that we identified, and certainly one of the things that they were curious about, and the area that I felt, if you were a third party looking at this, was cultural production. If you had blended use, if you had precincts where to use their description, artists sat next to accountants, to use that terrible image, would that make it more appealing? And without a doubt, it was interesting talking to all of these fairly hard-nosed developers, but very aware of commercial shift. They all saw the benefit instantly of having culture sitting within a core of commercial, where I guess 10 years ago, looking at that, we would not have had that discussion. There would not have been an understanding and be an agreement that this could be possible. So I think the idea is not just probably right, it's timely now, because across, I think, key cities globally, the same questions will be asked. And I think, interestingly, probably the same answers will be given, that culture will become a draw. I think your point about cultural production is more interesting, because actually it's not just using the places to showcase, it's using to manufacture, produce, create, which is a more, I think, relevant and vibrant way of revising the city. So I think probably in Melbourne, certainly in London, without a doubt, that's the thing that people are thinking about, that, to get you back into.
It's a slightly more sophisticated approach to, mixed use development, which is sort of, has become it's been brought down to basically, houses a shop and houses a shop and an office. it's pretty basic, but there has to be more of that. And we've discussed those before. And, it is that for some, and the energy which is created by having, the cultural sector, the scientific sector, the logistics, people who are thinkers and doers. And also I think what's interesting with a lot of cities is, so many of the office towers have been filled with, without sounding snobbish, middle management and a lot of bureaucrats. And that's not really what the cities were about. As we know, cities are about cities are the places for ideas and exchange of ideas, not the mediocrity stuff. And that's
I think they're the kind of people who are either preventing the ideas from flowing, because the benefit they have is entrapping knowledge. That I think it's Gillian Tett in her book about silo. So the problem with middle management is its job is meant to be connecting, but actually its real job is prevention. Yeah. It's to hold off, seal down, and to use ideas as a power strategy rather than as a way of enabling people. And I think, if you think about culture, one of the core values, I guess, and this is something I guess with M Pavilion, I'll be thinking about this because chatting to people like Ben, at the design festival, one of the things you realize is that a lot of events around culture is about exchange, it's about sharing, it's about collaboration, where business traditionally didn't embrace those principles because it saw it as damaging to the business process. So even in some ways, you're having to teach a group of corporate entities almost a different language for how the city could be built and should be structured. Because I was thinking about Melbourne's less prevalent to this, because you have corporate offices where something like the lanes will open out into the foyers of the offices, or you can pass through them. But in London, until recently, these things were sealed. You went to UBS, you were in UBS. It wasn't open to the street, and certainly wasn't open to somebody from the street coming in and hanging out. Where now there is a focus, and I think the next generation of CBDs will either embrace that as a core principle, or they will become those wastelands like downtown Hong Kong, where everything sits above the street and nothing happens on it. So I think that just on with M Pavilion, with given that you've had to restrict or change the programming and the thinking, what do you think coming out of lockdown you're likely to see as being the key drivers of both activity and artists and designers thinking about the future? Which areas do you think they're going to be focused on?
Well, interestingly, when you talk, I think going back a little, talking about what you were talking about, the in-between, people in between, the gatekeepers and people who prevent the connections. And if I look at what I've done with Melbourne Fashion Festival, it was a direct-to-consumer event, as M Pavilion is. It's a design-focused event activity, but it was never really talking. It wasn't designers talking to designers or architects talking to architects within that bubble. It was about talking to the user. It was the users of design and the users of architecture. It wasn't just talking about the people who were in that. So I think this direct to consumer attitude, which is sort of in a way that breaking down of that hierarchy, and in what we've seen from a retail perspective, is the wholesale disappears, because it's all about vertical. It's all about how you can go from manufacturing to retail, cutting out the middle person. In a way, it's also about, from a customer point of view, how you can go direct to your consumer. How I think even from a dealing with businesses, how we've all seen that the process of the Zoom meeting has actually cut out a lot of the hierarchy and a lot of the speed humps, which allow people to talk allow people within businesses to talk to one another. It's because there isn't that middle management who are saying, no, you have to talk to me first, because to some extent everyone is in it together, and that's interesting.
Yeah. So does that make gallerists the speed bump of the cultural sector?
Yeah. I think actually that's an interesting point. I think that could conceivably be the case. And really, if you think about, who are the highly successful artists, or, the highly, people like Picasso, people like Dali, they spoke direct to their audiences. And it'll be interesting to see how, I suppose something like the Venice Biennale was the great event of the last 20 years, which broke down the gallery collector audience artist relationship and made it much more porous. That said, it also came with its own hierarchies, but it'll be interesting how it, for instance, evolves, but also relationships between artists. And I'm sure a lot of artists, they have gone direct to their customer. Auction houses have sort of broken that link, I suppose, or roadblock.
Well, I'm aware of time, yes. So can we turn the tables now? And is there a question that you'd like to ask?
Oh, question. I have to do my thing first, don't I?
I'm sorry?
Don't I have to say my hello?
No, we'll do that in a second. But I mean,
we'll do that in a second. Oh, the question. Oh, I suppose. Well, what question? I suppose. What did I think about? I suppose the airline has to be. You love planes. I imagine that every airline that survives this is going to be subsidised by government.
Yes.
So, how many will survive?
Oh, that's a great question because it's so specific. I think probably one of the answers, like many industries that are currently going through this process, not necessarily just of evolution but revolution, is that you end up with monopolies. So you do end up with these hegemonies where it's the largest that survive, and they just eat up all the competition. And so one could say that we could end up with a situation where you get less than 10. And you end up with this collection of the airlines that are the best funded. So you'd certainly look at some of the Middle Eastern airlines, which of course are the ones that have massively taken leaps and bounds over the last 10 years in terms of both a service directive, but also a customer service initiative, as well as being so well funded. If you start to name them, obviously you look at Emirates, but then you also look at some of the slight outliers where there's been massive infrastructural growth as well. So like Turkish Airlines, because you've got a country where their stated aim is to become the most important transit hub for Europe over the next 20 years. And they've been progressively investing to make sure that happens. So I think you can look at very obvious examples and then look at the current demise of others, whether it be the US Airlines or British Airways in the UK, where whilst they're part of a much bigger group, so you could argue that actually, despite its unpopularity from a commercial perspective, BA as part of AIG probably does have a future, or the group does, because of the monopoly it controls as a group that manages and controls more than one airline. So I think we're highly likely to suffer from a lack of independence, a lack of commerciality, because I think it will be something that increasingly will have to be state funded to get it certainly over the hump of what the next 18 months looks like in terms of a return to travel. Yeah. And then, of course, we face the issue that until we really rethink the climate impact of long haul travel and short distance travel as well on airlines, I think we will see increasing restrictions on the amount that we can travel. And again, one of the predictions that we made a long time ago was that air miles stop being something that you give to reward somebody for their travel, but they in fact become a restriction on how much you are allowed to travel as a consumer. And I would still expect to see that kind of infringement come in, and therefore vastly reduce the amount that maybe we do travel over the next decade.
Yeah, I think the business travel will suffer, because not just because of cost and because of logistics, but I think you will have a generation of people that won't see the point. Increasingly, if I think about how much I would travel compared to how much I need to travel, I now understand that the need can become the requirement, and that it's going to be easier to deal with a lot of people, by Zoom or similar technologies. What I found more interesting, I was just kind of traveling yesterday to Berlin and back, is how easy we accept the benefit of no service as a sacrifice for helping the industry survive and us to protect each other. And I kind of feel, well, no, this is just another example of how service in other sectors have been ramped up. Retail, one of the great things of retail is now that we are getting back in some areas, you realize service has improved, home service has improved, the experience you're getting, where the airlines are using it to cut and cheat and remove any requirement. I mean, a woman walking up and down a cabin in a mask, handing out plates to people who are not touching her, but touching a plate or touching a tray, and that is not going to transmit the virus. And yet they're using these as excuses to reduce service. This is in first class as well as economy. So it's not just, people at the back having to suffer. And I think that is a symptom of how airlines will continue after the crisis, because they've got to cut corners, they've got to cut costs. I think what will happen is you will get economy hard pushed carriers, not quite like Ryanair, but certainly like EasyJet, ramping up service as a way to distinguish them. So while they will keep their kind of pricing, they will be going back to service deliverables that will not be unlike how it used to be in the great days of airline travel, where you got your food, you got your drinks, they were kind of pleasant to you in the aisle, because once you cut and cut and cut into the market, there's nothing left to cut except to be nice to people. And that's the reason why I think great businesses survive. They're just nice and they're kind and they're good and they give you something you're not expecting. And I think it will hopefully remind airlines that when we travel, it is not still a utility. We are traveling to work, and we're with you for, if you came to my house for 2 hours or 3 hours, I kind of feel I should be nice to you, but actually increasingly they're just treating you worse than a, dare I say it, as somebody said, if you put a cow into a truck or a case and you sent them across Europe, it would be illegal to put them into that space and to treat them in such a way. Like yesterday, we pretty much flew without being offered water. Reluctantly, I saw this woman coming up and down. So I think that the good thing about air flight is it will really distinguish it. I also think, and this is a kind of final point, it will accelerate alternative ways of getting passengers to different locations. So I do think that the long overdue revival of the airship, I was looking at Goodyear recently, Graf Zeppelin have come back onto the market. There are two big UK companies who are looking at low orbital air flight, which will use the equivalent of helium or similar type balloons. And it makes sense because they're no impact. They can take up to 800 to 1,000 people. And if we're saying that in the future we will travel less but travel longer, it makes sense to have the journey as part of the expedition, not the journey as part of the getting there and then getting out. So I think that there's also, somebody talked the other day about the new normal. I'm saying, how about the new extraordinary? Why do we want to go back to normal? It's such a dull place. And to go back there would be even duller. We've done it before. Let's not do it again. So I do think the air industry, I think the retail, I think hospitality, I think also culture, arts will absolutely be the industries and sectors that will find weirdly revitalization because they've had to ask questions in a more fundamental way. And I think a lot of other businesses that really have got through on mediocre abilities and management and CEOs and that will deservedly go by the wayside. So I kind of feel Brave New World potentially, it's all possible, but I'm not sure we have the imagination of the CEO, or rather CEOs with imagination that will help us get to this point. So I think there's more struggle ahead before we see the kind of light coming through the clouds, but it's a good time. What better time to be living in than these? I know Chris is kicking me under the table, telling me to hurry up.
That's okay. We'll see you. I hope to see you. Bye.
See you soon.
Bye. Bye.